Brute ships, staggered line. Shipmaster, they outnumber us 3-1.
Then it is an even fight.
All cruisers fire at will. Burn their mongrel hides.
Space combat is probably one of the most hand-wave aspects of most sci-fi universes. It makes sense because in reality it probably wouldn't be very exciting. My area of expertise, if you can call it that, is mostly on tanks and armored vehicles, but I've played like 500 hours of Kerbal Space Program, so that basically makes me an expert. Before I talk about why I don't think space combat will happen all that often, I'm going to talk about what I think it'll probably be like, and what the common misconceptions are. So let's get started. A lot of sci-fi universes make it seem like you break through the atmosphere and you're now in space, so you can freely move in any direction you want. This isn't really the case. You first need to perform another burn to make your trajectory orbital. You're essentially in perpetual free fall around the planet. If you wanted to say get to a space station that is to your right at that given moment, you couldn't get there just by burning to the right. You would need to perform what is known as an orbital rendezvous, where you essentially adjust your orbit to a point where you pass extremely close to a station, and then match that station's orbit when you arrive at that point. From there, you can dock with the station. You can imagine how difficult it would be to intercept a ship in orbit, especially one that is aware of the intercept and really doesn't want to get caught. There's also the notion that large capital ships would be commonplace. There's a few reasons why we would likely stick to smaller ships. For one, maneuvering a capital ship in space would require a ton of time and force. There's also the possibility that the ship would be so large that it would crush itself while decelerating. This obviously depends on how the ship is constructed, but it's less of an issue with smaller ships. Perhaps the biggest issue with capital ships is that if a capital ship was disabled while it was maneuvering, that could put it on a suborbital trajectory, meaning that a ship weighing tens of thousands of tons is now crashing into the planet at multiple kilometers per second. This kind of impact would be extremely devastating, being more destructive than nuclear weapons. The weapon types that could be used on ships would also be fairly limited. You obviously want whatever limits the amount of debris and foreign objects floating around, so that precludes most kinetic weapons and missiles, unless you have a good way of cleaning up debris. You also want a weapon that is near instantaneous, due to the sheer distances that ships would be engaged over. That means that the most likely weapon to be used by spacecraft would be lasers, but even those would create debris. Lasers would most likely be used not to destroy a spacecraft completely, but to overheat and disable critical components such as engines, life support, and RCS systems. It's incredibly difficult to cool down components in space, so disabling components with lasers would be fairly easy. Just shoot them with the laser until they overheat. Though lasers themselves would overheat pretty quickly as well. From there, the winning spacecraft could leave the enemy crew to expire, or attempt a boarding action. The latter is obviously extremely risky. Counters to lasers would likely be developed pretty quickly. Maybe something more futuristic like particle cannons would eventually replace them. Spacecraft are also designed to withstand extremely high temperatures, so some lasers would only be able to destroy unarmored components. Railguns or other kinetic weapons could potentially be used, but they would probably be fairly easy to dodge under most circumstances. There's also the problem that, even if you make the projectile self-destroying, there would be debris flying around at incredible speed, and it would never stop until it eventually hit something.
If you pull the trigger on this, you are ruining someone's day, somewhere and sometime.
Guided munitions would likely be fairly commonplace and effective, so I believe that point defense guns and active protection systems would be useful for combat ships. Spacecraft capable of operating in and out of atmosphere likely wouldn't be around for a while either. Space planes obviously exist, but using one as a template for a combat-oriented spacecraft severely limits your options. In order to make such a craft possible, we would need to invent energy shielding capable of acting as a heat shield for re-entry, extremely powerful engines capable of keeping the craft flying both in atmosphere and out of it, and a power source capable of running said engines for a long time. And now on to why I don't think space combat will be all that common. Starting a fight in space is kind of like being the first person to use nuclear weapons in actual combat. It'd be breaking a massive precedent, so no one wants to be the first one to do it. Up to this point, space has been reserved for peaceful intentions and the overall betterment of mankind. No country wants to go down in history as the first to break that. Nations will still research and develop space weapons just in case someone decides to start a fight. Anti-satellite missiles are already fairly common. As I mentioned earlier, starting a fight in space also creates a ton of debris, and to a greater extent, what is known as Kessler Syndrome. Space debris is incredibly dangerous to spacecraft. Even small objects can do devastating damage due to their sheer velocity. Kessler Syndrome refers to a situation where there is so much man-made debris in orbit that space travel essentially becomes impossible. Destroying a spacecraft creates an enormous amount of debris. Anti-satellite missiles can create tens of thousands of trackable objects. It'd be common sense to avoid bringing warfare into space until we have a good way of cleaning it up. Space is also so vast and full of resources that there's very few reasons we would need to fight in it. Space has more resources than we would ever realistically need, and they're pretty easy to access relatively speaking. There could obviously still be conflict for other reasons, like revolutions, but fighting over our limited resources is one of the biggest reasons we have conflicts. There likely wouldn't be any conflicts until a long time after colonies become self-sufficient. So to summarize, space combat will be incredibly rare, and when it does happen, it will likely be fast-paced long-range sniping matches between laser-armed craft. At least that's my take on it. As I say in pretty much all of these videos, I could be completely wrong. Reality doesn't always make sense, and that's the fun part of making these videos. People can have two different opinions derived from the same basic facts, but I digress. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.